We were the poorest of the poor, and that was a part of the identity. I'm a university professor now, but I never can remember a time growing up that I ever said, I want to be a university professor. I was born and raised in the rural South, and I was one of 12 children. I was second from the oldest. We lived in extreme poverty. The early part of my life, we lived in a two-room shack, and it was literally a shack. It's so tiny. And my elder sister and I and some of the younger, the children that were the first kids, we slept on the kitchen floor. The house did not have any running water or indoor plumbing, and not having a bathroom in the house, and so really having what the older people call a slop jar in the house and having to empty that, those are things that made it very difficult. You had to put a pot on the stove and heat up the water to bathe in, and all of us bathed from that same cruddy pail of water. And you know, you can imagine by the time it got to the third or fourth kid, it's pretty dirty. And it was not uncommon for us to go into the local dumps looking for whatever we could find. Growing up in that shack, all I can remember is just sadness. It was very depressed. I always felt unloved. There was always conflict in the house. There was never enough of anything. There were fights every Friday when my stepfather got paid. There would be a fight between my mother and the stepfather, but these would be really violent fights. The most graphic memory is my stepfather chasing my mother with an axe, threatening to kill her, and the children, we were running around, you know, grabbing at his legs, trying to protect our mother. Later, my mother moved to the city when I was probably 12 or 13 and became involved with social workers and welfare programs. And what I watched happen in my family was that it became a way of life for her and for some of my siblings. And I saw what a trap welfare is, and for many people, and still for some of my siblings, they've never held a steady job. At that time, I was a high school dropout. I had dropped out after completing the 8th grade. I felt shame, I felt fear, I was depressed. And so I married at 16, not because I was in love. I married a neighbor that was a little bit older just to get away from home. Part of the misery that I experienced in my childhood, some of it just continued into my marriage and into my early life. At some point, I started taking bottles of pills and I really wanted to die. I had the experience of being in the hospital after one of my suicide gestures, having a medical doctor tell me that I was intelligent, that I was attractive, and that kind of shocked me because I was, you know, at least 20, 21, and I'd never heard anyone tell me that I was attractive. He said, you're intelligent, you're attractive, you can do more with your life. I took a job outside the home, I filed for divorce. Everything started to change, and at one of the nursing homes where I was working as a nurse's aide, I met an African orderly from Sierra Leone. He said, you ought to go to college. And those words changed my life. I studied hard. I earned my GED. I worked hard doing whatever I could do to get by, and I was able to graduate from a community college, go on to a 4-year college, and graduate magna cum laude, and I went on to earn several graduate degrees. Somehow, I always believed that I could do it, that I could better myself, that I was not meant to be poor. I was able to far exceed anything that I imagined for myself or anyone else probably that was watching my life unfold. These milestones, my accomplishments, didn't come easy. It was through hard work, it was perseverance, a can-do spirit that I attribute to the grace of God. It is so amazing what a little encouragement and direction can do. But the system itself doesn't encourage people to better themselves. The social welfare programs that we have in America puts a Band-Aid on the problem, but it does not fix it. The only thing these programs do is create, in the long term, a sense of entitlement that results in a loss of self-worth for the individual. The truth is, people feel good about themselves when they can work and provide for themselves and for their families. Thank you. Now look at me. I'm black, female, one of 12 children, born and raised in rural poverty, raised in a 2-room shack, no running water. Often we were hungry with little food. It was a broken home. My parents were divorced while I was so young that I don't remember when they lived together. I had a stepfather. There was lots of abuse. Both my mother and my stepfather were alcoholics. And like the film indicated, there was a fight every weekend whenever my stepfather got paid. But my mother, she was one of those women livers. She got a divorce early on. And when you think about it, in the 1950s, there weren't that many women getting divorces, but my mother got a divorce. And my mother had polio. She developed it when she was a child. She was probably 2 or 3 years old. And so one of her legs is about 1 inch shorter than the other. Her feet are deformed. And she was able to walk while we were children, but she always believed that we were ashamed of her if we walked ahead of her, that her children, were ashamed of her. And I know that she wore pants and to cover up for the differences in her legs. And during that era, not that many women wore pants. And so my mother had a lot of issues going on, but she was a strong woman. And it's taken me a long time to acknowledge that despite all those circumstances I grew up in, that my mother played a strong role in making me who I am today. And as a child, we didn't go to school very often. There was one year we missed 80 of 180 days. Now you all out here in North Dakota, it snows a lot, right? And you have clothes for the winter. Well, we didn't. And so often, if it snowed and it was deep, we stayed at home until the snow melted. And so if it was one of those winters where the snow got up like this, it took it a long time to melt, right? And so we missed a lot of school. The year that we missed 80 of 180 days, everyone in the household failed. And so failing school was a part of my experience as a child. When I dropped out of school after the 8th grade, I dropped out of school, and all of my siblings dropped out of school after the 8th grade. Married at 16, not because I was in love, not because I was pregnant, just to get away from home. So I was a teen mom. I was bullied. I was called names. I was called Frankenstein. And if you get close to me, you'll notice that I have a scar that's in the right place for Frankenstein. And so I was called Frankenstein and Fish Eyes by my siblings. And as a child, I felt like I was the ugliest person in the world. And people today would refer to me, many people would look at someone from my background and see a victim. They would see someone who was underprivileged. And according to social scientists, and today's social scientist activists, I would be underprivileged, a victim,
going nowhere, doomed to fail. And yet, I didn't. They're wrong about a lot of things, aren't they? And my marriage was my escape. During that time, my self-esteem was so low, and think about it, I thought I was the ugliest person in the world. I was thrilled that anyone would have me, so I married a neighbor who was 4 years older. He had a job, he had a car, and that was all that was needed to get me away from home. And this man did something for me that no one else had ever done. He took me to a fancy dress store and purchased my first store-bought clothes. And this was a fancy women's store, and I was a teenager, and so those clothes didn't fit my body. So they were kind of hanging on me as a frame, but it was special. It meant a lot to me. And by the time I was 17, I had my first child. But my life was always different. I was buying, at the age of 17, a new house. There was a program that some of you older people like me, in my age range, would remember. It was FHA 235, and all you needed was $300 down, and my husband had his tax refund check, and so we were buying a brand new house. We watched this brick ranch house being built from the ground up. And my life was always better than anyone else in my family. And, you know, I can't explain it. I've always been blessed. I've always had more, but that was a source of great guilt in my life. And I often wondered why me, and that why me that continued into my Princeton years. Now, I'm giving you all this background because when I end this part of my presentation about my life, which will help you understand my CRT position, we'll go into part 2. So this is a 2-act evening. And so it starts with Act 1, who is Carol Swain? And so that's what I'm giving you right now. So 1970s, a recession, stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation, price controls. And what I remember was that my husband wasn't working very much, that we didn't have much food. We were not on welfare, but there were hard times, and things were not okay, but they were about to get harder. During the 70s, I had 3 children. I had one in 1971, one in 1974, and one in 1975. And I can remember, I wasn't driving then, walking to the store with a child strapped to my chest, one on my back, and one by the hand. And the last child, my daughter, died of a crib death when she was 3 months old. And during this time, and even before, I struggled with the depression, the suicide gestures. I ended up in a hospital in the mental ward due to my suicide gestures. And I call them suicide gestures because I was always very careful to get rescued. In fact, I was very successful in getting rescued. And during one of those suicide gestures, I met a young white intern. And at that time, he spoke words that changed my life. He told me that I was intelligent, that I was attractive, that I could do more with my life. I hadn't heard those words before. And I could think back to elementary school, and I knew that I was smart, but I had forgotten. But it meant a lot to me that this young white intern was telling me those things. No one had ever spoken those words to me before. 50 years later, I finally get the courage to contact him. So we now have this relationship, my family, his family, or me and his family. And I was to learn that he is and was a devout Catholic, and he was only 4 years older than me. He said he remembered me. He always wondered what happened to me, but he was not on the internet. He didn't watch Fox News or even CNN. He was busy, went back to Ohio. I don't want to get into his name, but he went back to where he came from, living in a small town. And then one day I got the courage to pick up the phone and called him. But his words changed my life. And I began to think of myself differently. I got a high school equivalency, and this was 1975. That was the year my life changed in dramatic ways. I got my high school equivalency. I took a job outside the home. In fact, I took many jobs outside the home. I worked in a garment factory. I worked in fast food for half a day. I was too shy to call out those orders. I gave people what I thought they should eat. And people are so nice because no one complained, but when my shift was over, I turned in my uniform. And so I have a lot of respect for people who do fast food because I couldn't do it. I sold things from door to door. I worked in nursing homes. And in one of those nursing homes, an African orderly from Sierra Leone spoke the words that would lead me to college. This African orderly told me that I ought to go to college because he went to school with a lot of people who weren't as smart as I was. And so I investigated. I learned that I could go to college with a GED. And so 1975, life as I knew it ended. I filed for a divorce. I became a single mom. I was briefly on welfare. I could only last about 3 months. That was not for me. And my goal at the time when I started college was to get a well-paying job to be able to support my family. So in 1976, I started Virginia Western Community College. I earned my 2-year degree in business in 2 years. I said I earned my 2-year degree in business in 2 years. And I wanted to do art because I have art talent. In fact, I am a right-brained person living in a left-brain world. And so I've had to make do. I was told by my counselors to be practical, and I was always a person that I mentored well. And so whatever people told me I needed to do to be successful, I just followed their advice. And that is the secret to my success. And I could end the story here, but I keep going for a little while longer. So I got my 2-year degree in business. I thought I was going to be a store manager. All I wanted to do was to manage a store at the mall. I applied for jobs, and I was told that I needed a 4-year degree. So I guess I needed a 4-year degree. And what happened then was that I decided that I needed to distinguish myself in some sort of way because I'd filled out those job applications. I'd made the dean's list a couple of times, but I needed something to put on the job applications. And I checked out books from the library, or I purchased books on how to make A's in college, how to take essay exams, how to take objective tests, and I applied those principles. And I went to Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. I graduated magna cum laude with a 4-year degree in criminal justice. I chose criminal justice because it had the least amount of math. And at Roanoke College, I distinguished myself. I started a scholarship for minorities. It was meant to be an academic scholarship, and all of that's another story, long story. It's an endowed fellowship now. I started getting national recognition. Schools started contacting me, but I had no interest in continuing my education. All I wanted was a well-paying job. And so I decided by the time I was finishing the 4-year degree that I did not want a career in criminal justice. I was going to do what a lot of black people do. I was going to work for the government. And so I went to Virginia Tech to get my master's in political science and public policy. And while I was there, my professors discovered me. And they urged me to continue my education. They wanted me to become a professor. I had no interest in that because I was shy. I was so shy that if someone asked me my name, I would forget it. And So being a professor or being a teacher was the last thing I wanted to do. And what's interesting was that even though I was an honor student and I was known across the city, and really I had national attention, I'd won a national awards, I could not get a job. This was the 1980s. Affirmative action had some teeth, and I couldn't get a job, but there was a recession. I have to tell you, there was a recession. And I ended up choosing to apply to graduate school. I applied to Carolina and Duke. I ended up getting a generous fellowship from Carolina, and I went into academia. And I was very successful there because, again, I mentored well. Whatever they said I needed to do to be successful, you had to give conference papers, you had to come up with original ideas. And anyone who knows me or who follows me on social media knows that I'm never at a loss for words or ideas. And so I did very well in academia as a student, so much so that when I started applying for jobs, I was known around the country. And I ended up with a short list. I got offers with signing bonuses, and I ended up taking a position at Princeton. I told them when I was hired that I was going to get early tenure. At Princeton, maybe like, I can't remember what the odds were, but the odds, maybe like 1 in 7 or something like the odds of getting tenure were kind of astronomical. And I can't remember exactly what they were, but I got tenure. And I told them when I was hired that I would do it in 3 years. I ended up going up in my 3rd year, having it awarded in the 4th year. And I had accomplished, like all of my goals. Everything came easy to me for a while. At Princeton, I won 3 national prizes for my first book. I won the highest prize a political scientist can win. The book that won these prizes was cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. It has 3 Supreme Court citations. I was earning more money than I ever imagined in my life. And I became, I'd achieved that goal of supporting myself on one income, but I can tell you that I was miserable. And even when I was winning those awards, there was no satisfaction because I had already anticipated that I was going to win an award. I just wondered which one. And so when I won the awards, it was just relief. It was relief, there was no surprise to it. And so I was sort of miserable. And the depression returned. And my life just, was sort of like spiraling out of control. And that set in motion a journey, a spiritual journey, that I'll tell you how it ended, but I would describe myself like all of my life I was this person that was sort of like a seeker. I was always seeking answers, and I had accomplished, what more than I ever imagined I would accomplish, and I was unhappy. And mid-1990s, I was in an automobile accident, rear-ended, whiplash, injuries that resulted in physical therapy, and I ended up in a hospital, the Princeton Hospital, for a medical condition, but I had a spiritual experience. I had the experience of my life being played out in front of me as if I had a narrator, and I thought that I was dying. Because all of my life I'd heard that if your life plays out in front of you, that you're going to die. And so I was very surprised when I woke up the next day and I wasn't dead. And it was just so much confusion. But that was a life-changing experience for me. There was actually a Pentecostal chaplain at the Princeton Hospital, and anyone who knows anything about Princeton would know that a Pentecostal chaplain should not be at the Princeton Hospital. And there was a cleaning lady at the hospital that threw a book in my bed about Jesus, and anyone that knows about workplaces knows that a cleaning lady should not be throwing a book into a patient's bed about Jesus. But she did, and I got the book, and that changed me somewhat, but I was still seeking. And I became very dissatisfied. You know, with Princeton, I was associate professor, I was tenured, but I was not happy. And then Vanderbilt came along. And I was going through this journey when they came along. Now, people from the outside couldn't see what was going on in the inside. So Vanderbilt, to them, they were hiring a hotshot Princeton professor. And back in those days, tenured professors from the Ivy League did not leave the Ivy League to go to a lesser university. If you were miserable in the Ivy League, you stayed in the Ivy League unless another school came along, but you did not leave the Ivy League to go to a lesser university. But I chose to go to a lesser university, and many of my colleagues said, "You going where? Where? Vanderbilt? Where's Vanderbilt?" Now, they wouldn't say that today, and many of my former colleagues have left Princeton, they've left the Ivy League, and they're at other universities, they're at Vanderbilt. Now it's very common for people to go wherever they want to go, but it wasn't back then. And I negotiated a deal with Vanderbilt, and I've always been a good negotiator. You might not want to negotiate with me, I'm a good negotiator. So I negotiated my sabbatical up front, and at that time I had 4 degrees. I'd earned my PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. I did that in 4 years, and as some of you may know, it takes a long time for some people. They never finish their dissertation. I finished mine very quickly. And I went to Yale. And I went there and I entered a program, a master's program, to get a degree in law, because I started wondering if my work was, you know, getting so much attention in the legal world, maybe I missed my calling. Maybe I was supposed to become a lawyer. And so I went to Yale to see whether or not I was supposed to become a lawyer. And what happened while I was there is that I discovered that my search for meaning came to an end, because while I was at Yale, I found God, and I came to an understanding of what I was seeking, in the sense that, looking back at my life, this search for meaning had taken me through agnosticism, Eastern religions, and I was just all over the place. But while I was in New Haven, I had a Christian conversion experience, and I began to look more closely at all of my beliefs. And I became interested in political parties, what the political parties stood for. And I'd been a Democrat all of my life. You know, if you're black and you're from the South, you're born Christian, you're born Democrat, you're born black. And so I was a Democrat. I always knew the Democrats were the party for the working man and for civil rights. And the Republicans were the party for the rich and for the businesses and for the racism. Everybody knew that. But I began to look at the world more closely. Before I was, the political scientist, and I always tried to give different views. I was never a person that just tried to look at things in one way. I always felt like there was truth on different sides, and if you get people together in a room, somehow the middle ground would be the place to be. But I began to look at the party platforms more closely. I saw contradictions. I was troubled. And then I started to look at all the things that I thought I knew were true. And I looked at history, and I realized that I had been indoctrinated, that a lot of the things that I thought were true were not really true. And as I began to grow in my faith, I became an independent. And I was an independent politically for a number of years. And as an independent, I was appointed to 3 political positions. President Bush appointed me to the National Endowment for the Humanities. He appointed me to the Tennessee Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and President Obama renewed that appointment. And later I was to be appointed by President Trump to the 1776 Commission. So I can stand here today to say that I have had political appointments from 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, and the Democrat was President Obama. And as I was changing, this 2008 election and the things that were happening in our country that started happening very, very quickly, and that's when a lot of the stuff that relates to the CRT and the Marxism, all of that stuff began, to start to leave the university campuses. And I became very disturbed about what I was seeing. 2009, I started a book that's not here tonight called Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise. And I wrote that book because I noticed that 78% of the American people in 2009, they professed to be Christians. And if you looked at the politicians they were electing, if you looked at the policies we had in place, it was clear that there must be a disjuncture between what people believed. Either they didn't know the tenets of their faith, or they didn't know what was happening in this country. And so I wrote Be the People in an effort to educate people about the changes I saw taking place in the country. And one of the things that people have noted about my work is that it's been prescient. And in that book, I warned about the alliance that was being formed between the National Security Agency and Google. And during that time, Google had already been caught scanning the computer drives of members of Congress who had unencrypted data. And the National Security Agency was beginning to forge a relationship with Google. I knew that that was not good. The other thing that was taking place is that there was information leaked to the public that the Obama administration Pentagon was setting up an office of strategic deception. And what this office was, they wanted permission to set up an office that was supposed to create, get this, fake news to deceive our enemies in other countries. And I have enough sense to know that whatever you do in other countries finds its way back into the United States. Knew that that was bad news. At that same time, President Obama was seeking permission to assassinate American citizens suspected of terrorism. And he was granted that permission. And so I knew that that was very, very serious, because in America we had this little thing, presumption of innocence, due process. And so if you are targeting people who are suspected of terrorism, they've not had a trial, they've not had due process. These things were taking place. And so I saw Orwellian tendencies and directions taking place in America, and I warned about that. And in the book, Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise, I talk about America's founding and the things that distinguish us from the rest of the world. A lot of the chapters in the book dealt with public policy, but in my conclusion, I felt that for us to be a nation, that there were certain things that every American needed to know, that everyone needed to read the Declaration of Independence, that everyone needed to read the Constitution, that everyone needed to know the Bill of Rights, and that everyone needed to know the 10 Commandments. And you might say, the 10 Commandments, well, my primary audience for that book was the Christians in America, the 78%. But if you look at American law, if you look at our literature, if you look at so many things that are part of our society, unless you know certain things about our culture, and religion has played a major role, you can never understand what it means to be an American. And so I wrote that book. And that year, 2009, was when I became a Republican. Not because I thought Republicans that Republicans had all the answers or that they were perfect. They came closest to my beliefs, and that is why I became a Republican. And they were closest because they shared my beliefs about God, country, and family. I've always loved America. I've always believed in the American dream. And so when I was out there working, I believed that if I worked hard enough that I could make something of myself, and I did. And I watched universities as they began to change. I watched as academia became increasingly more uncomfortable. I watched the attacks on free speech. I watched the attacks on our Constitution. I watched the attacks on our traditional values. And I made the decision in 2017 to leave academia. When I left academia after 28 years of teaching, I walked away from everything I knew. I gave up tenure. No one in their right mind gives up tenure. It's a lifetime appointment. And contrary to whatever you may have read somewhere, I was not fired. Vanderbilt never pressured me to leave. In fact, it was very convenient for them to have me there, because when the alumni said, Vanderbilt, you don't have any conservative professors, they would say, no, that's not true. We have Professor Swain. And so I made the decision to walk away. And if you're a professor, if you have a PhD, the only things that you are qualified to do is to teach and to do research. And so for 2 years, I was kind of out in the wilderness, trying to make a living. And today, I can report that I used my training to teach to the world. So the world has become my classroom. So to you, I say, welcome to my classroom. Class is now in session. Thank you.
Public education has gone off the rails.
Once you get into this idea that it's really the government's job to educate children, you end up in a very, very dangerous place, and I don't see anything good coming out of that.
When we look at this radical agenda, the way our children are being exploited and the way parents are getting shut out, it comes down to one fundamental question. Whose children are they?
Whose children are they?
Whose children are they?
¿De quién son esos niños?
Whose children are they?
Where did this idea come from that we're even asking whose children are they?
It's where all the money is. It's why the union is there. It's why it's so corrupt.
Now it's about power and money and politics, and somehow the kids are getting lost in all of that.
Our teachers are bullied. Parents are shut out.
America as we know it is being reimagined in a very dangerous way.
That just lights a fire into my butt, and that's why I want to put a stop to critical race theory, so that a lot of friendships can be saved and that we can just all get along.
I hesitate to say that there was a silver lining to COVID, but parents suddenly had this window into what their children were learning day in and day out.
Critical race theory is dividing our children in ways that are unacceptable.
It pits one race against another.
You cannot use racism to eradicate racism.
Less than 1/3 of America's school children are proficient in anything.
They're teaching these kids X-rated sex acts.
I don't want my daughter exposed to that.
The school system wants to indoctrinate us teachers first before we indoctrinate your kids.
Certain ways of thinking are approved, and certain ways of thinking are not.
They sentenced me to jail because I wanted a better education for my daughters.
They're not interested in tolerance.
Their whole goal is to intimidate, to silence the opposition.
There's so much damage done by the lockdown on the students.
Days turned into weeks and then months.
It doesn't actually surprise me that there's been more suicides. I know I've had those thoughts.
They told me, if you want to teach, you'll sign.
We want to make sure that
teachers know that you do have another option.
Right now in schools, it is not safe to be a teacher.
This was the most preventable mass murder in American history.
Less than 30 seconds, it was done.
And my daughter was murdered at the school.
It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you're a mom and a dad first.
And if we lose this battle on the educational front, then we lose not only our country, but we lose our kids. And we lose the ability to bring our children up the way that we want.
They are assaulting parental rights. They are not respecting our cultures, our values. They're not respecting our voice.
The reality is we're not dissenters, we're the parents.
So the question has to be asked.
Now that film is something that you can bring to your community and show it, you know, to your small group or to your church. And I think you'll want to do that. And if you want to find out more information about how to do that, go to whosechildrenarethey.com. And I wanted you to see that film because the people that you saw interviewed and others are people who have been fighting this battle for a long time. And for myself, I have seen this coming. During the years I was at Princeton, a lot of my colleagues were interested in critical race theory and postmodernism, all of these philosophies. And I was a congressional scholar. I wasn't that interested in what was happening in the philosophy department. I had no idea how it would impact my life later. And it was, 2008, 2009 when I started to realize just how it had begun to affect every sector of the university. And what I did was I went back and I read, about Marxism. I began to study it. And during my last years at Vanderbilt, I taught a course on the impact of communism on American political thought. And I would have a waiting list for that class. And the class had a policy that it was a free speech zone. I gave the students permission to speak about whatever was on their minds, as long as they were respectful to one another. And I gave myself permission to speak. And I made it very clear during Drop Ed Week that my classroom was not a safe place for people who were sensitive. And that if they were sensitive, then they needed to find somewhere they would be more comfortable. And there were not a lot of people that dropped. And I was told by the students that often, late in the night, they would be together talking about the class and the things that they were learning. And I can remember one of the students telling me, Professor Swain, if you were right, people like you wouldn't be able to teach here. And I often, wonder, what that student thinks now. Because, we were hitting on these issues that we're living right now. And you sort of could see things moving in that direction, but I never thought things would happen as quickly as they did. And for me, with the critical race theory, again, I started seeing it at the university level in the 2000s. In the late 2000s, you may remember the political correctness movement and the microaggressions. And microaggression is a perceived slight. It's not anything that's overt, it's perceived racism. And you've heard of cultural appropriation. If you're white and you have your hair braided for the beach, then you're appropriating black culture. Or if you order Mexican food for a party, you're appropriating Mexican culture or whatever kind of culture. I don't know how you appropriate white culture. German food. Okay. All right, but And so during my time at the university, we got to the point where there were trigger warnings that you were supposed to give to students to let them know that something might happen that would make them feel uncomfortable. And it reached the loony stage where there were professors at Harvard who teach rape law. They were told that, by students who protested that they couldn't teach rape law because there may have been someone in the class who had been raped, would be made to feel uncomfortable. And at one time, as a professor, if you were going to teach a course or a book, you could do what I did. You could give the warning, and I guess my little statement during drop ad and what I had on my syllabus, that all of that was like a warning, a trigger warning, because I told the students what to expect. It became that was not enough. And so if you're a literature professor and you've always taught, Mark Twain or some book that has the N word, all of a sudden, you couldn't teach the things that you'd always taught. And there was these moves to remove some of the, I would say, great books from the Western world from the classroom. And that was an attack on Western civilization altogether. All of this was taking place. By the time I left academia, there was also the personal pronouns. We were told, to indicate our personal pronoun or to respect someone else's personal pronoun. And, the personal pronouns include he, she, they, ze. There are others. I didn't memorize them all. They didn't apply to me. I wasn't confused about my personal pronoun. But all of that craziness had begun to just accelerate. And within the school system, we saw restorative justice become part of the Department of Education, in the sense that there was concerns that black children were being punished disproportionately to white kids and that they were being suspended from school more. And then in the criminal justice system, there was a concern about how many young black men or how many blacks were incarcerated. And so the solution was to basically make it more difficult for teachers to suspend students that were unruly in the classroom. And it ended up with a situation where some of the most violent kids could not really be kicked out of the classroom. And so there were teacher injuries. There were situations where kids who wanted to learn in school were afraid to come to school because of the ones that were in school for mischief that you couldn't do anything about. Kids that would have been in some alternative school in a normal system. And in parts of the country, that's still going on. Impossible almost for teachers to suspend the worst of the worst. And in the criminal justice system, there are these children that are just constantly committing crimes, and also adults that use them to commit crimes, knowing that there'll be no consequences, that they send the child home again and again and again until they kill someone or until they engage in a violent act. And then at that point, the criminal justice system has to deal with them, but their records are sealed, until after they become an adult. They may have, 25, 30 convictions or brushes with the law, violent behavior, and then they go on to create some kind of heinous crime. But up until that time, they get returned to their environment. All of that stuff was taking place long before the average American heard about critical race theory. And tonight, we're going to talk about critical race theory. I'm going to, walk you through this book that was published in August of 2021, Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the house being our home, America. And that's a book that was written for people like you. And when I wrote Be the People, which was published in 2011, that was my first book just for the general public. I stopped writing for political scientists. I stopped writing for other academics. I started writing for the American people. And spring of 2021, I had so many parents contacting me about CRT and what was taking place in their schools, and they were asking for help. They wanted me to speak. I couldn't go everywhere, and I realized they needed a primer. And so my goal was to get a primer out, very, very quickly. I hired a research assistant, and it was a young man from Georgetown University, new PhD, white, devout Christian, military background, married, 2 kids, unemployed. Not because, that he wasn't qualified or brilliant, but because he was white, military background, and conservative. And so I hired him as a research assistant, and he was so good at what he was doing, I made him a co-author. And we got the book finished in less than 2 months, probably about 6 weeks. And I self-published it. And it was my first time self-publishing a book. And I self-published it because with traditional publishers, it can take a year or so or longer to get a book published. But we were able to turn it around, and it has been a bestseller. It's the best-selling book I've ever published. And my goal was to explain to people what critical race theory is, where it came from, how it impacts our society, how it manifests itself, why it's anti-Christian, why it runs counter to our civil rights laws and our U.S. Constitution. And our book has 2 chapters on how to fight back. There are 10 proposals for people that they can put in action immediately as part of fighting back. It has a glossary. It has appendices of resources, as well as some of the ways that CRT disguises itself, because it doesn't necessarily call itself CRT, in the classroom. It hides as social emotional learning. It hides as action civics. It hides as culturally sensitive learning. It hides even in civil rights courses that are part history but part distortion, part of an effort to demonize white people. And so this book, and tonight is about CRT, but I can tell you that there are other critical theories that are impacting your schools that are just as serious and maybe more serious. And critical theory itself it has roots in cultural Marxism, postmodernism, critical legal studies. All of these things are part of critical theory. So it has these Marxist roots, but it's also connected to other things. And I'm going to read you the definition that we have for critical theory. And I can tell you that for critical race theory, and this book starts off with the story of how Chris and I came together, where we stand. We're both Christians, and what we see as the path forward. And we both oppose critical race theory. We believe it's a racist worldview that is not consistent with who we are as an American people. We believe that people should organize and fight back against it. And defining critical race theory, I can tell you first how it operates. It divides the world into oppressors and the oppressed. And with critical race theory, white people are all oppressors. It's believed that white people have structured the American society in a way that benefits themselves, and that civil rights laws and all the progress that we've made in America was part of white people structuring a system to benefit themselves, and that all minorities are victims, that they are victims of white racism, and it is really rooted in conflict theory. And it's ludicrous for anyone to believe that critical race theory or diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it is being practiced and taught throughout America, can ever bring about racial reconciliation. There's no way that you get racial harmony and reconciliation out of conflict theory. And this book is set up in such a way that at the end of each chapter, there are discussion questions or study questions. And so these are short chapters. It's not a long book. You use those questions. If you can't answer them when you finish the chapter, you go back through and you read the chapter again. And then you know you got what we were trying to convey. But we define critical race theory as a fundamentally racist worldview predicated on the claim that racism is in the DNA of American institutions and society and in white Americans. It sees minorities, especially Black Americans, as victims of systemic racism that permeates a vast network of structures. It also sees all disparities. Any disparity between and among groups, it all has to be attributed to racism. And for anyone who would be so naive as to believe that, they should read Thomas Sowell's work about different racial and ethnic groups and how they differ. But that's pretty much how they see it. They see all white people as being privileged. And that includes those poor whites in Appalachia. And if you think about J.D. Vance and his relatives that he introduced us to in his book, A Hillbilly Elegy, that those people are somehow advantaged. And there are people in Appalachia, you know, that come from generational poverty. Families, you know, didn't go beyond the 3rd grade. They're still living in a hollow. There are still people in America that live in shacks without running water. There's poverty there, and there are far more white people that are poor than Black people. So there are poor whites, and I think they'd be pretty insulted if you told them they had all this white privilege we're hearing about. And part of the argument about CRT is that racism against minorities didn't end in the 1960s when we passed 3 major civil rights bills. And I can tell you that I was born in 1954. That was the year of the Brown versus Board school desegregation case. I was born into a system of systemic racism. I watched that system collapse. I watched the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. I watched the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Bill and the 1968 Open Housing Bill. And the passage of those 3 major civil rights bills in the mid-1960s made us equal under the law. And it created opportunities for people like me. I was able to take advantage of those opportunities. And I can tell you that when I was working those low-wage jobs, there were plenty of poor whites who were working right alongside me. We all wanted that 25 cents an hour raise. We all needed it. We all cared about our children. And so it's really hard for me to get caught up in the things that people get caught up in today. I think that social class, in the sense of the economic disparities of being poor, that may be a greater barrier, certainly, than race. In my own life, my race has advantaged me probably more than it's disadvantaged me. It's advantaged me because I always defied stereotypes. In college, or I can tell you about myself, I can't sing, I can't dance, and I can't play sports very well. But I was good with academics. And so part of what I did was defy some of those stereotypes. And I can tell you that the people who encouraged me to continue my education, almost all of them were white. Many of them were white men, and that was because that was who was teaching primarily at the universities. But no one ever treated me like I was handicapped because I was Black, or that I should expect less of myself. And so I set high standards for myself, but they also set high standards for me. I didn't plan to get a PhD. These people kept pushing me to go forward and telling me that I could, and I can tell you that I never saw myself as handicapped because I was Black, I'm poor, I'm a woman, I come from an abusive family. All of those things that we use as excuses today, no. You know, what you believe about the world, that makes a tremendous difference, your attitude. And I believe that had I come up in today's system, had I heard the things that we tell our young people, white and black, I don't even know that I would have put forth the effort. You know, maybe I'd still be in poverty in southwestern Virginia. I did not have anyone sending me those negative messages. And so I was able to go out there, I was able to excel. I had role models. My role models didn't look like me. So that's more of my background. But with critical race theory, it starts off with a lie. Critical race theory is racist. Critical race theory is dangerous. It has no place in our schools. It should never have escaped the university campuses. Where does it come from? Well, part of it is cultural Marxism, and cultural Marxism grew out of economic Marxism. When Karl Marx's economic theory failed, some of his students were very puzzled as to why the revolution he predicted never took place. And they began to look at the culture. They felt that Western civilization and Christianity in particular was a problem. And so they began pretty much to the slow march through the institutions that Lenin spoke of. And in this book, we have a section on cultural Marxism that talks about the development, the theorists that were behind it, and their sources. Lots of citations in this book that will introduce you to who the theorists were behind the development of cultural Marxism. Critical theory itself, like we're talking about critical race theory, but there are other critical theories. There's critical queer theory that's in our schools from K through 12. There's critical feminist theory. That's where you get toxic masculinity. That's where you get the war on our males. Postmodernism, you may not know it as postmodernism, but you've heard of cultural relativism and the argument that there are no objective truths. All of that was rooted in postmodernism. And if you think about the progressives and the political left, you know, they told us, that everything was relative, there was no objective truths, there were no absolutes, but now they present us with absolutes. And the absolutes they present us with is they have it all worked out. And we were told as Christians or as conservatives, we were fundamentalists, we didn't believe in science. And now you see that with this new regime, this new way of thinking, the people who adhere to these theories, they're not able to discern a male from a female. You have to believe, according to them, that biological men can give birth and can breastfeed babies. And there are all sorts of things that you're expected to believe from these people that are so smart. They graduated from Harvard and Yale and all of those places. They have all the answers. And there's a scripture, thinking themselves wise, they became fools. And that's where we are today in our society. Critical legal theories, and that's associated with Derek Bell. And Derek Bell was a Harvard professor. He was the first tenured black professor in the law school at Harvard, and he was very upset at white folk that he came up with the critical race theory. And he was behind this whole idea that when the Civil Rights Acts passed, and if you actually look at what was taking place, the Civil Rights Acts were passed because you had whites and blacks and Asians and people from different religions working together. We came together. According to Derek Bell and the critical race theorists, white people did that to benefit themselves, and they set up a structure that is against minorities. They can only rise so high. And so part of the roots, chapter 3, cultural Marxism, critical theory, postmodernism, critical legal and race theories. That's where critical race theory, parts of the roots of critical race theory. And some of you may have be familiar with James Lindsay's book, Cynical Theories. And he was a professor, and he has a book that goes into more detail about postmodernism and the roots of critical theory. And even secular humanists, people at the universities that are not, religious by any means, they see how dangerous this is. They don't like the attack on free speech that is taking place at our universities. And when you look at critical race theory, we have a chapter on critical race theory and traditional American values. Critical race theory is un-American because all of the things, individualism, a belief in freedom, a belief in, free speech, the Constitution, all of those things under attack. The classical liberals, they're not on board with critical race theory. At the universities, there are a lot of people who are atheists. They're not happy with what's taking place, but a lot of people are afraid to speak up. There are some people at the major universities, the Ivy League, as well as other universities that have formed a group that I'm familiar with that started at Princeton. They're trying to, push back and trying to make the universities hospitable to divergent views. They've not had success yet, but at least there are people that are coming together and they're trying to make it happen. And with critical race theory, there's another chapter on America's Christian heritage. And what we find is that critical race theorists have gone into the church, and that started actually in the 1930s, and it came under the umbrella of social justice. And social justice was always Marxist at its roots, and social justice was a term that was meant to confuse Christians, and for people who were ready to be confused, it was easy to do. And what we find is that biblical justice, what the Bible talks about, has been confused with social justice. And you see churches, in my denomination, I'm a Southern Baptist in particular, just being torn apart by critical theory and intersectionality and all of these concepts that don't belong in the church. We know that the biblical view is that from one man, God created all nations of men, and he allotted the places where they were to live. There's always been migration. We are equal under Christ. And the Christian view of race relations is a view where we're all brothers and sisters. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. None of us are perfect. That's why we needed a Savior. And there is a place for repentance. There's a place for forgiveness. And once the repentance has taken place and the forgiveness extended, we ought to be a model to the rest of the world as to how to work out racial differences. The church itself should be the model, but instead we find the church appealing to secular theories as if they themselves didn't have the answers. There is a chapter on critical race theory, the U.S. Constitution, and civil rights laws. And critical race theory runs totally counter to the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race or color. And many white people, when they think about our civil rights laws, they think about, well, they used to think about civil rights as being something that applied to racial and ethnic minorities. The civil rights laws protect all persons in the United States, and it protects white people too. And so white people have rights as well as other racial and ethnic groups. They have a right to expect a workplace that isn't hostile, to expect a learning environment where their children are not shamed and bullied because of the color of their skin. And one of the things that I encourage white people, I would also encourage other racial and ethnic minorities. And I say other because in parts of the country, whites are already a minority, and by 2047, they will be a minority in this nation. But people need to know the laws and be able to document and file cases and bring cases when necessary. And I'm saying this at a time when everything in America seems to be up for grabs. You know, the country that I loved, I've always loved and always knew, it's transformed into something that I scarcely recognize. And so we had this situation with this Supreme Court nominee that was selected in a way that I would say was a violation of our civil rights laws and our Constitution, because it narrowed competition to black women. And so it did not, so it discriminated against black men, white men, white women, Asian men, Asian women. The only group looked at were black women for this Supreme Court position. And so this person who was set on the court was selected in a way that's unconstitutional, violation of civil rights laws. So it's up for grabs as to what our civil rights laws will look like in the future. Because it seems that with progressives, the political left, that they have already indicated a desire to violate these laws, and so the laws may be eliminated. But until they are eliminated, you have every right to expect non-discrimination. Non-discrimination is the law of the land. Equal accommodations is the law of the land. Critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion is not the law of the land of the way it's being practiced across America. Now, strategies for resisting critical race theory's influence, and these are the last two chapters. And the substantive part of this book is about 80-some pages. And then there's the glossary, there are lots of footnotes, and there's appendices. And it's a short book, so you can get through the book. But we want you to survey the battlefield, to look around and see what's taking place. And then we want you to join the battle, to exercise voice. And that's what you're doing here tonight. And that is what, that's what the organization of parents, that's what the pushback that's coming from the grassroots. It's about people exercising voice. When you pull your child out of a public school where they're being discriminated against because of the color of their skin, or if you leave a workplace where you're being discriminated against, you're exercising exit, and that's your right to exit. There's a place for guerrilla warfare. And when I say guerrilla warfare, I don't mean, violence of any sort, but people being very strategic, gathering information. Sometimes, people keeping a low profile, going into places where you wouldn't be welcomed if they knew what you were thinking, keeping your mouth shut, gathering information that can be used to benefit others. And that's how many of us know what is taking place in the classrooms, because teachers have provided information to organizations, as has children. They have provided information. They have done video recordings, but it's pushing back. And then we have 10 proposals for resisting CRT. And I'm going to very quickly go through these 10 proposals, and then I'm going to end by taking your questions. This is in the last chapter. The first is continue to research what CRT is and where it comes from and how it manifests itself in our society. We already know that when you say that CRT is taking place in schools, that the answer is no, it isn't. CRT is not being taught in K through 12. We want you to challenge the legality and constitutionality of CRT in education and in the workplaces. All of you can do that. You have to document. You have to know when your rights are being violated. Organize grassroots movements to elect school board members, city council members, mayors, governors, who will stand for your rights, who will work to eliminate CRT, and build broad coalitions that stretch across race, ethnicity, and political party. The transformation that took place in Virginia took place because people came together across partisan lines. At the end of the day, everyone loves their children. People know right from wrong, and they came together and they were successful. Educate your church leaders. A lot of pastors need help. And encourage them to lead on racial issues using biblical principles rather than social justice. bring pressure to bear on corporations and other institutions that support CRT, stand up to big tech companies, and we really have to continue to be vigilant. Republicans, when they had a majority, they had an opportunity to get rid of, to impose some restrictions on big tech. They didn't do it. They missed the opportunity. And for those of you all that are thinking, oh, the Republicans will have a clean sweep, and if they can get the House and the Senate, things are going to be different. When Republicans have had the White House, the House, and the Senate, you come to see that, in the words of George Wallace, there isn't a dime's worth of difference between the two political parties. Now, there's more difference today than there were back in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, but we've been disappointed again and again by our Republican leaders. They have to be held accountable. And you can't go by what they say. You have to know who they are and look at what they do. We can monitor state and local agencies. Monitor state and local agencies to ensure that taxpayers are not subsidizing organizations that advance hostility to America and to American values, and develop alternatives to diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI training. And one of the things that I've done in 2020, I incorporated a new business called Unity Training Solutions. And the purpose of Unity Training Solutions was to offer an alternative to the diversity, equity, training that is being imposed on organizations all across America, on corporations. And that is a space where conservatives, people who believe in the Constitution, need to compete. Because again, you cannot bring about harmony and reconciliation using a conflict model. And what is happening is that corporations, organizations are bringing in these trainers, and they create conflict. They create conflict where it didn't exist before. They leave organizations worse off than they were before. And they also take you off your mission. Every organization has a mission. Every organization was formed for a particular purpose. It wasn't formed, to right the wrongs of history or to become, social workers or all of these things that deal with the social, emotional state of the employees. No, that's not what organizations were formed to do. And I believe that you can have successful teams, you can keep organizations on mission, you can develop individual talent if that is the goal. And so we have to have alternatives, and so I've tried to provide one. And before we get to the point of taking questions, there are two videos that I would like to show you all. The first one was produced in 2010. Kimberly Crenshaw, a professor that came up with intersectionality, this view that that marginalized groups can have multiple sources of disadvantage, and that the voices of people that are disadvantaged, the more intersectionality boxes you can check, the more moral authority you have to speak to the issues in the world. And so me, black woman, poverty, high school dropout, teen mom, all of these things, my lived experiences trumps science, history, everything you can throw at me, because I have a greater moral authority because I have a lived experience. And that's why white people are told, you just shut up and listen. You can never, be a black woman, you can never be a gay person, you can never be that. Because of my disadvantages, I have the right to talk, and you have the responsibility to listen. And that is ludicrous. Yes, it is. And but that's what critical race theory tells us. And I want to play these two short video clips, and then I want us to talk about what's on your mind and hearts.
Hey, line up! Line up! Everybody line up! We're about to race! Everybody line up! Shoulder to shoulder. Take off your backpacks. Basketball, line up. We're about to race. Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. A $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. Take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I have said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story. Because the reality is, if this was a fair race and everybody was back on that line, I guarantee you some of these black dudes would smoke all of you. And it's only because you have this big of a head start that you're possibly going to win this race called life. That is a picture of life, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing you've done has put you in the lead that you're in right now. When I say go, on your mark, get set, go! If you didn't learn anything from this activity, you're a fool.